The night everything fell apart, the city was quiet in a way that felt almost cruel. Streetlights flickered weakly over empty sidewalks, and a cold wind pushed old newspapers across the road like forgotten memories. Amina sat alone on a broken bench at the edge of the park, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the ground. Just weeks ago she had believed her life was finally beginning to make sense. She had a small apartment, a stable job at a clothing store, and dreams that seemed close enough to touch. But life had a strange way of shifting the ground beneath her feet without warning. The store where she worked closed suddenly after the owner declared bankruptcy. Rent piled up quickly. Friends she thought would help disappeared behind polite excuses. Within a month, everything she had built had slipped through her fingers like sand. Amina still remembered the moment she realized she had truly hit rock bottom. It happened on a rainy afternoon when she stood outside her apartment building holding a small cardboard box with the last of her belongings. The landlord avoided her eyes as he locked the door behind her. The rain soaked through her thin jacket while people walked past pretending not to notice. In that moment, something inside her cracked, not loudly like shattering glass, but quietly, like a thread finally breaking after being pulled too tight for too long. She wandered the streets for hours that day, unsure where to go, unsure who she had become. For several nights she slept at the park, wrapping herself in an old blanket she found near a trash bin. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but what hurt more was the weight of failure pressing down on her chest. She replayed every decision she had ever made, wondering where she had gone wrong. Each memory felt like a door closing behind her. Sometimes tears slipped down her cheeks silently in the darkness, but most of the time she simply stared at the sky, feeling strangely empty. One morning an elderly woman approached her while she sat on the same bench. The woman carried a basket filled with bread and fruit. Without asking many questions, she handed Amina a small loaf and a warm smile. "Everyone falls," the woman said softly, "but not everyone learns how to stand again." Then she walked away before Amina could respond. Those words lingered in Amina's mind long after the woman disappeared down the street. Days turned into weeks. Amina began visiting a small public library nearby because it was warm and quiet. At first she only went there to escape the cold, but soon she started reading books about business, psychology, and stories of people who had overcome impossible situations. Page by page, something inside her slowly shifted. She realized that the people she read about had also experienced moments of deep failure, loneliness, and fear. Yet somehow they had turned those moments into beginnings instead of endings. One afternoon she found a notebook in a donation box near the library entrance. The pages were mostly blank. She sat at a corner table and began writing down ideas, small things at first, like ways to earn a few coins or skills she could learn. Writing made her feel less helpless. Each word felt like a tiny step forward. Amina remembered how much she loved repairing old clothes. When she was younger, her mother had taught her how to sew patches onto worn fabric and turn damaged clothing into something beautiful again. She started visiting thrift shops and collecting discarded garments that people no longer wanted. At night, under a dim streetlight near the park, she carefully stitched and redesigned them. Slowly, she created unique jackets, dresses, and scarves that looked surprisingly stylish. The first time she tried selling one of her pieces was at a small weekend street market. Her hands shook as she laid the clothes on a simple cloth on the ground. At first people walked past without looking. Hours passed and doubt crept back into her mind. Just as she began packing her things, a young woman stopped and picked up a redesigned denim jacket. She examined the stitching and smiled. "Did you make this?" the woman asked. Amina nodded nervously. "It's beautiful," the woman said before buying it without hesitation. That single sale felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. It wasn't much money, but it was proof that her effort mattered. The next week she returned to the market with more pieces. Then the week after that she brought even more. Slowly, curious customers began returning to see what new designs she had created. Months passed, and the small cloth on the ground turned into a modest stall. Amina saved every coin carefully. She slept less in the park and occasionally rented a tiny shared room when she could afford it. The journey was far from easy. There were days when nothing sold and nights when exhaustion threatened to crush her determination. But the difference now was that she no longer felt completely lost. One evening a local boutique owner visited the market and noticed Amina's designs. He studied the stitching closely and asked about her process. When she explained how she transformed discarded clothing into fashionable pieces, he looked impressed. A week later he offered to place a few of her designs in his shop. Amina could hardly believe it. The first time she saw her redesigned jacket hanging under bright shop lights, tears filled her eyes. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life instead of her own. Yet deep inside she knew every step had been real. The cold nights, the hunger, the quiet determination that pushed her forward when nothing seemed possible. As the months turned into years, Amina's work gained attention beyond the small boutique. People admired not only the unique designs but also the story behind them. She eventually opened a tiny studio where she hired 2 assistants who had once struggled as she had. The studio was filled with fabric scraps, sewing machines, and laughter that echoed through the walls. But success did not erase the memories of her lowest days. In fact, those memories became the foundation of everything she built. Whenever someone asked how she managed to succeed after losing everything, she always paused before answering. She knew the truth was complicated. It wasn't a single moment of courage or a dramatic turning point. It was hundreds of quiet decisions to keep moving even when hope felt fragile. One winter afternoon, years after that first night on the park bench, Amina returned to the same park. The bench was still there, slightly rusted but familiar. She sat down and watched people walk by, remembering the version of herself who once believed life had ended there. The memory no longer filled her with pain, instead, it reminded her how far she had come. As she sat there, she noticed a young girl nearby crying softly while holding a torn backpack. Something about the girl's expression felt painfully familiar. Amina walked over and asked what was wrong. The girl explained that her family had recently lost their home and she felt ashamed going to school with broken things. Amina gently examined the backpack and smiled. "I think we can fix this," she said. The girl looked surprised. They spent the next hour sitting on the bench while Amina carefully repaired the torn fabric with thread from a small sewing kit she carried. When she finished, the backpack looked even better than before. The girl's eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Amina watched her run off with renewed confidence. In that moment she understood something powerful. Her success was not only about the studio, the sales, or the recognition. It was about the ability to transform broken things, clothes, opportunities, and sometimes even people's spirits, into something stronger. Life continued to surprise her in ways she never expected. Her designs eventually reached online platforms where customers from different cities and countries discovered her work. What began as a desperate attempt to survive had grown into a brand known for creativity and sustainability. Journalists wrote articles about her journey from homelessness to entrepreneurship. Invitations to speak at community events followed. Yet each time she shared her story, she avoided making it sound like a perfect fairy tale. She spoke honestly about fear, loneliness, and the long nights when she almost gave up. She wanted people to understand that success rarely arrives suddenly. It grows slowly, often in the shadows of failure. Years later, when Amina finally opened a larger workshop, she placed a small framed object near the entrance. It was the first notebook she had found at the library donation box. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, crossed-out ideas, and hopeful plans scribbled in the margins. Every employee who joined the workshop asked about it eventually. Amina always smiled before answering. "That notebook," she would say, "is where my life started again." The truth was simple yet powerful. She had hit rock bottom. She had experienced the kind of silence that makes people believe their story is over. But instead of letting that moment define her forever, she slowly rebuilt her life piece by piece, just like the clothes she repaired. And in doing so, she created something no one expected, not even herself, a life shaped not by the fall, but by the courage to rise afterward.